All right, so this is the lecture on the biology and characteristics of life part of the first set of notes that you got. So this set of slides is attached to the science and scientific processes slides. So those were in blue, these are in green, okay? So biology is the study of life, okay? Bios means life. Okay, and ology, and you can't see that, sorry y'all, yet again. Ology equals the study of, okay? So in this case, this is going to be my first example of if I give you a prefix or a suffix or a root word and I don't write it down, that I'm telling you to write it down. Like if I say, what does this mean if you put this prefix in front of a word? Write it down, then I really want you to stop and write it down, okay? So I'm going to maybe not do that so much at this point if I can help it, in order to just speed up the lecture a little bit. So in general, basic definition of an organism is it's any being that possesses all of the characteristics of life. There are 8 characteristics. So for something to be alive, okay, to be a living organism, it has to have all 8 characteristics. Otherwise, it is non-living, okay, if it's lacking even one of those. And again, we're going to deal with that there are chemical phenomena going on inside of organisms and physical things happening with organisms as well. And so I'm just going to draw your attention to the fact that this says energy right here, okay, and that in middle school you probably learned potential mechanic, I just lost my train of thought. Solar energy, you learned about different types of energy basically, and that you weren't probably studying biology at the time. Excuse me. So then here, the concept of unity within diversity, that says over time through evolution, each species has become unique, but all species are connected by the characteristics of life. That should really be up on the other line there. So essentially what this means, so here's a little molecule of DNA in the picture there, and this is all the different groups of organisms. So we've got 2 different groups of bacteria, okay, down here, and then we've got protists, which you may not have ever heard of. So these are your bacteria groups. You probably know that word, protists. Okay, and then we're going to put 2 groups here. And then plants, fungus, and animals. So all living organisms have DNA to code for traits, and we are connected through these characteristics of life, but we have different adaptations in order to survive in different environments all over the surface of the earth, okay? So that's the concept of unity within diversity, that through the process of evolution, that each species is unique, but we're connected by all these, or by these 8 characteristics of life. All right, so what are they? So the first characteristic is just cellular organization, okay? So organisms are made of either one or many cells. If it's one cell, it's unicellular. If it's made of many cells, it's multicellular. And basically, we got to talk hundreds to thousands of cells to be an organism. We're not talking like 5 cells, okay? So multi means many, uni means one. By definition, a cell is the smallest unit capable of all life functions, including growth and reproduction. So we're not going to get into tons of detail with this, but these basic terms you do need to already know. We'll cover cell structures and functions more eventually. So all cells are going to contain genetic information, DNA and RNA, okay, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. More to come on those, obviously, at some point as well. Eukaryotes versus prokaryotes, okay? So eukaryotic cells, this is everything except bacteria. Okay, bacteria are the only prokaryotic organisms. Okay, all other organism groups, plants, animals, fungus, and protists are all eukaryotic. So you might want to write those next to eukaryotic, like I just wrote only bacteria next to prokaryotic. So prokaryotic cells are really simple. That picture on the left, this is a prokaryotic or a generalized prokaryotic diagram of a bacterial cell. They're really simple. The DNA is just going to float in the cytoplasm, so there's no nuclear envelope that surrounds that, and there's not other membrane-bound organelles. Okay? Eukaryotic organisms, these cells are much more complex. The DNA is inside the nucleus, which on this particular diagram, that's the nucleus right there. Okay, so the DNA is inside that nucleus, and then they contain other membrane-bound organelles, okay, which means little organ. When you put L, E-L-L-E, on the end of something, it makes it mean small. All right, so with eukaryotic cells, just think of this as your house, as far as good analogy, a quick analogy, that you cook in your kitchen, that you sleep in your bedroom, that you wash clothes in the laundry room. So each walled off space has a different function. So in a eukaryotic cell, each organelle has a specific function. All right, so our second characteristic of life is homeostasis. This is one that for us right now is kind of hard to understand the big picture with this, but this is one of those characteristics that basically life as we know it wouldn't exist if we didn't have maintenance of internal stability. But it's kind of a hard concept sometimes. So sweating is a great example of that. Okay, so again, I would ask you in class, why do you sweat? Hopefully we all know that we sweat in order to cool our bodies down. So if you were to go outside and it's 90 degrees and you're going to go on a walk, you're probably going to start sweating pretty quickly. Okay, so if your body temperature gets too high, sweat is going to be produced from sweat glands. It's going to get to the surface of your skin and it's going to evaporate off your skin, and that allows your body to cool back down a little bit. Okay. There's another one that's kind of related to that we'll get to on another slide with another concept. Blood clotting. So this is one we talk about a lot. Actually, all three of these others are ones that we talk about in anatomy. So if you fall down and scrape your knee this afternoon, hopefully you're going to form a scab eventually. And so what happens is that when you injure yourself, that certain proteins are going to draw platelets, which clot your blood to that area. And then that's going to create more proteins. That's going to draw more platelets. That's going to create more proteins. That's going to draw more platelets until you have a nice scab so that you don't continue to lose more blood. When mothers are nursing their infants, the production of milk, that's a homeostatic mechanism. If that baby continues to nurse, then that mother's going to continue to produce milk. If the mother weans the baby, then their milk production is going to decrease and eventually stop altogether. And then another good example is that during exercise, for example, if somebody's running a marathon, they need a lot of energy to actually run the marathon. They don't need to make urine during the marathon. So essentially when you're exercising, your kidneys start to function in a different way and you produce less urine. So those are some really quick homeostatic mechanisms that are human body examples that might make some sense to you right now. We keep this real simple for now. Okay. The next one, metabolism. So our layman definition of metabolism is basically we kind of think how much you can eat. Okay. Like, oh, I burn calories so fast, I can go to Krispy Kreme and eat a whole dozen donuts and I'm not going to gain a pound. And then your friend says, well, if I take one bite of a Krispy Kreme donut, I'm going to gain 5 pounds because I don't burn calories very fast. Well, that's not really what it is. So the basic definition from a true biological standpoint is it's all the chemical reactions that occur in an organism. Okay? So we're dealing with chemistry here. It says it involves gaining and using energy for all daily processes. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, even if it's really simple, like sleeping, then you are using energy. And so you've got to have energy in order to get energy. Okay? Big concept that we're going to cover. All right? So it says some organisms produce their own nutrients. So that's autotrophs or producers. So that's going to be your plants, your photosynthetic bacteria, and your photosynthetic protists. You might want to write that down. Okay? So using the sun's energy to make their own food through photosynthesis. Okay? Auto, I'm going to give you some. So auto, this is one I'll write down for you. Okay? If you don't already know this, auto means self. And then troph, let me come up here. Troph means to feed. Okay, so these are self-feeders. They use the sun's energy to make their own food in the form of sugars. Okay, that's why when you go to the produce section of the grocery store, that's where you're buying plants, for example. Right, so then the next little bullet, it says some organisms must get nutrients from another source, and they're known as heterotrophs. Okay, so troph again is still going to mean to feed. Hetero means different. Okay, so these are organisms that have to gain energy from another source. Notice this does not say eat. Okay, so consumers versus decomposers. So consumers, this is going to be your animals. Some protists are consumers. Okay, and that's it. Decomposers, that's going to be your fungus and your bacteria. Okay, these are going to break down dead organisms and return nutrients to the soil. Okay, and they're going to do that in a different way than consumers, who literally take food inside of the body, like you and I, like through your mouth, through some sort of orifice, even if it's not called a mouth on a consumer, and that they digest that food internally to gain energy. Decomposers are going to digest their quote-unquote food source differently, okay, and we'll explain that more eventually. We're not ready for that, okay? The next, reproduction, on the next slide. All right, so reproduction, by definition, is just the ability to create offspring. It can be asexual or sexual reproduction. Asexual means that there are no gametes involved, and sexual reproduction means that there are gametes involved. Gametes, okay, are either egg or sperm. Can you see that? Okay. So that being said, essentially reproduction is to keep a species from going extinct so that that species stays on Earth. Okay, by definition, a species is a group of organisms that look alike and they're able to breed and produce fertile offspring. Okay, if the offspring are unable as an individual to reproduce, that doesn't make that individual not alive. Okay, so you might have heard that sometimes there are couples that they can't conceive a child, they can't have a baby. Then that man or that woman or both, whatever the situation is, that doesn't make them less human. It just means that they have something going on physiologically that isn't working, but they are still alive and members of the human species. But fertile offspring means that they can make their own offspring. Okay. Then the next one, heredity. So heredity, by definition, is the passing of genetic factors or traits from parents to offspring. So that's where we'll talk about DNA a whole lot, and proteins and how we get from DNA to a trait. Lots to come on that, just not anytime soon. And kind of up in the top right-hand corner, there's some little pictures of chromosomes and DNA again. The next one, growth and development. So these are two different things, but they're lumped together as a characteristic of life. So growth, by definition, is the increase in the amount of living matter that makes up an organism. Okay, so if you think of a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old, okay, there is more mass in a 15-year-old than there is in a 5-year-old. Okay, so that's growth. Development is the changes that an organism undergoes as it matures throughout its entire lifespan. Right, so literally, from the moment, I'm going to go back up to the idea of egg and sperm. From the moment that egg and sperm meet, okay, when they meet, they make what's called a zygote. And I'm just going to write that right here. Okay, the minute that zygote is formed, it's going to start to develop. Okay, and it's going to grow and mature. If we're talking about sexually reproducing species, sorry, I just realized I might need to go back up to that in just a second. But the moment that that zygote forms, then it's going to grow and develop into a mature organism. It's going to gain mass as far as growth goes, but it's going to change. So if we look at this plant picture, then that's a good example of just a seed there. The seed has sprouted. We can see tiny little roots. Okay, we can see the leaf up above the surface of the ground there, and that is going to occur. Development is from essentially, like I said, the moment a zygote forms, right, to the day that an organism dies, right? So we're constantly developing. Okay, so today you're in a different place, technically, developmentally, sorry, can't get my words out, than you were yesterday. You're in a different place today than you will be 2 months from now, okay? I just realized, let me go back up real quick to reproduction as far as asexual goes. So sexual reproduction involves egg and sperm. Asexual reproduction does not. So bacteria, for example, reproduce asexually, okay? So do single-celled protists, so does yeast, is the only single-celled fungus. All plants and all animals reproduce sexually. On your own body, when you're making new skin cells, that's basically the idea of making those new cells is the same thing as thinking asexual reproduction. But the fact that females make eggs and males make sperm, and then those join together to make a zygote, then that's where we're involving gametes, okay, in sexual reproduction. And plants reproduce sexually as well, so do fungus, and so do multicellular protists. So some of those things I just said, obviously we'll get into more details eventually. I just want you to have a better understanding of what some of the terms mean with a little bit of explanation right now. All right, and so the last two characteristics, the ability to adjust to the environment or surroundings. Okay, sorry about that, I was focusing at the same time. Using adaptations, right, and then evolution. So adaptations, by definition, adaptations are inherited characteristics that enable an organism to respond to a stimulus and survive in its environment. Okay, so organisms are born with adaptations, whether we're talking birth of an animal or birth, quote unquote, of a plant, okay, or fungus, whatever it is. Adaptations are there from the get-go, okay? You cannot acquire an adaptation, right? So let's talk about this. So a stimulus, this is the environmental factor to which organisms must respond, okay? Stimuli can be biotic or living factors or abiotic or non-living factors, okay? So a being in front of a word as a prefix makes something mean like not, the opposite, okay? So again, one of the things that I'm going to do this year is whenever I can give you prefixes and suffixes and things like that and root words and what they mean, that's really important just in general to understanding biology because we have so much vocabulary that we cover, but it's also just a great ACT strategy for you to know prefixes, roots, and suffixes, okay, for being more successful in the ACT and just in general with other classes. So that being said, let's talk about these examples here. So let's start with the plant. So sunlight, right, is the stimulus that's going to allow a plant to grow. We'll just keep that really simple, okay? Let's talk about the eye, right? So you have a pupil, the little dark spot, okay, in the middle of your eye that changes size. And if we were in class, we would have a discussion about this instead of me telling you. But let's say that you are out in the sunlight and you walk from a sunny environment into a darker building, okay? Or that you go from the darker building out into the sun. Your pupil's going to change size, okay? When you're in a dark place, your pupils are going to dilate or get larger. And when you're in a bright environment, your pupils are going to shrink or constrict. So when they shrink or they constrict, let me back up. Let's say you walk out of, again, a dark building into the sunlight, that your pupils are dilated because of you being in that dark building. Then you walk out into the sunlight and man, you're probably going to squint. It's probably going to kind of hurt at first, but it'll take a second and then your pupils constrict because you only need so much light getting in, okay? But it's got to change to varying light levels, okay? The pupil size does. And then this little man shivering here, okay? So shivering is a good adaptation to talk about and kind of link it to homeostasis. So I mentioned sweating with homeostasis, that if our body temperature increases, we sweat in order to cool off. Well, sweating's an adaptation, okay? This, he's shivering. So shivering is an adaptation to increase body temperature. So that's another homeostatic mechanism. Okay. Notice he's got on gloves and a sweater. That's not an adaptation. He was not born with those, but he was born with the ability to shiver. And shivering just increases our body temperature very briefly, okay, or very little. It's a quick muscle contraction, doesn't do a whole lot for us to increase body temperature too much, but it is an adaptation, okay? So, all right, so then the last one, evolution. So notice the definition is super simple. It says species slowly change over time. This involves changes in DNA. So this is going to be the very last characteristic that we cover during the course of this year. We're going to cover all the other characteristics first, and then we're going to pull them all together to talk about natural selection and evolution. Okay? So there's a lot that we have to get to before we can make really great connections to cover this well. Okay? So this is where species change slowly over time. Scientists really can't see the process of evolution happen within the course of a lifetime typically. It's really long and it's really slow. And it involves changes in DNA, okay, mutations building up in DNA. So lots to come on that, okay. Evolution is a term that kind of gets a bad rap. We gotta dispel some things with that, and we'll talk about nature selecting for good traits, okay, and selecting against traits that just don't work so well. So again, more to come, but I was going to mention too that other things can evolve besides species. Several examples. So fashion is a great example of evolution, that if you just look at trends from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, okay, now in the 2000s, we're about to be in the, or we are in 2020. So what are the things that we are seeing different as far as fashion trends go? Body styles of cars, that's another good example as far as evolution, that those change. Technology in general would be, if I said, so give me an example of something that changes that's not biological. Y'all would all say technology. And what you'd really be thinking about, most of you, is phones. So when I first, well, let me back up to my dad as an example. So my dad had a car phone, and it came in this giant bag, and it had a spirally cord that you plugged into at the time. And when I was a kid, most cars had a cigarette lighter. So you plugged it into the cigarette lighter to talk on the car phone. And then slowly phones got smaller. My first cell phone was huge, and you basically didn't really use it unless you had to because it was expensive. And now, wow, we can do all kinds of things with our phones. So that is, of course, an obvious explanation or obvious example of evolution for you guys. So I know for this particular lecture and the one on science and scientific processes, you might feel like they're kind of long and I've rambled a little bit, but what I do really need you to understand is that part of me explaining things in some detail and giving you some specific examples of things is this is really just scratching the surface for now on some of this. Some of the things I've said may lead you to a question, and if we were in class, we would have discussion about this instead of me just lecturing. And so with this particular set of notes, I wanted to impart some of that, what we're missing essentially, that we're missing a discussion in order for us to be on this staggered schedule and to start school the way we're having to start. So there may be some other lectures that are kind of like that. There may be some that it's just me explaining a topic, but I wanted to give you a little bit more information and kind of gear this one towards we would have a discussion, because especially with some of the places in these first two sets of notes, they are very much scratching the surface. Let me know if you have questions.